Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution, where this podcast is for taking up space for BIPOC, inclusive, secular, progressive homeschoolers. And we welcome allies here as well. I am your host, Ashley. I am a homeschooling mama of 3. I've been doing this almost 8 years. And when I jumped into the world of homeschooling, there were not a lot of resources for secular progressive homeschoolers. There's a lot of neutral resources, but not purely secular. So here we are collectively as a community taking up space. Today's episode is celebrating Hispanic or Latin Heritage Month. And I will be honest, we are not going to wait for the policymakers to validate our own experience and our people. We are not putting our joy or our culture on the back burner because all of these immigration crackdowns and broken systems. We are going to celebrate anyway. Despite it all, we have always celebrated. It is ingrained into our culture and our being. So let's get into this celebration. One more thing, please like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment. If this episode moves, share. I greatly appreciate it. And also, my website's almost done. I've restarted this thing because I keep watching all the videos and TikTok suggestions, but it should be out by next week. Anyway, let's get into the topic. So let's start with the basics. When does Hispanic Heritage or Latin Heritage Month begin? It runs from September 15th through October 15th. And I know because Black history starts on the 1st. Why did they choose the 15th through the 15th? Well, these dates were selected because September 15th is Independence Day for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And then right after that, you get September 16th, which is Mexico's Independence Day. And then September 18th is Chile's Independence Day. October 12th got pulled in because it's also the day of Dia de la Raza. And it's a day that's celebrated in many Latin American countries where they revolutionize and reclaim from Columbus, and they take it back and they don't celebrate him at all because they choose to celebrate indigenous and mixed heritage resistance. That was new information to me when I was doing the research. But again, that's information that I learned that I'm going to share with my kids and, intertwine it in our lesson. So when we hear these dates, we understand that the timeline is not that random. It's a reminder of colonialism, revolution, and resilience. And I think those are things we can look back on and reflect and use today. These nations, had to fight their way out of being enslaved or colonized enslaved by Spain, And their independence, our independence, is tied to blood and struggle and the refusal to be erased. So when we're looking at in the U.S., we see Hispanic Latin Heritage Month. It gets flattened into something very shallow, like you get, a margarita if you're grown, and then you get a school hallway of tissue paper flowers. You'll get a mariachi band. There's always a mariachi band, and I love this busy season for them, right? And you'll get school cafeterias always offer tacos, and there's, Taco Tuesday becomes a bigger thing. And I feel like this is very surface level diversity, and it's a very performative celebration. But for our communities, it is survival, and it's a refusal to disappear, because we can look at language. Generations of kids were punished for speaking Spanish in schools. I know my abuela did. And it was even worse for her, I believe, at times because she was so like white presenting. Um, and so for her to like dirty her white presenting self with Spanish, that was offensive to people in West Texas. But they were able to keep the language alive at home, in kitchens and living rooms, even when the world told them not to. And that's beautiful that they were able to survive and keep the language alive. Let's look at culture, because then when we look at Dias de los Muertos altars and, rhythms, these traditions aren't just cute holidays. They're a way of keeping identity alive when assimilation has been demanded. And labor, I've shared with you, my grandfather was, and his family, they were cotton pickers. They were field workers. And they worked in fields and factories and kitchens and railroads, and they were not invited guests in these places. They were exploited for their labor. And yet they built legacies for their kids, and that's survival. When I think of my grandfather, my popo, he's my idol. I can hear my grandma rolling in her grave, but she always thinks we favored him more than her. But to me, he was just so magical. But this man had a third grade education. He owned many rent houses, opened a restaurant. He was just, he barely could read. And he just didn't let any of that stop him. And he was bold and fearless, and just everybody loved him once you came into contact with him. But, he didn't let anything keep him down. And then let's look at the art and storytelling that comes from the Hispanic Latino cultures, right? We get the writers and the poets and the musicians, and their art carried entire histories forward when textbooks erase them. And that's why we know about figures like Jose Marti, Gloria Anzaldúa, or Julia de Burgos, because they refused silence. And Hispanic Latin Heritage Month is not about recognition from the government, because they created cages at the border. Even Obama did it. It's true, right? I know how much people like to put him on a pedestal, but he did it too. It doesn't make it right, doesn't make it cooler, because Mr. Suave who's great at speeches, he was wrong. And again, this is more than a PR campaign from corporations that exploit immigrant labor while they get to put made in Hecho en Mexico signs on all of their products. And this is about teaching our kids that we came from people who survived. That should be celebrated. People who held on to joy and food and music and faith when assimilation and erasure were the law of the land, and people who made space where none existed. And it's more now than evident that we lean into these lessons for our kids, because the world is feeling really heavy, especially if you're an immigrant in this country. So when we celebrate this month, we are not asking for permission. We are not waiting for validation. We are reminding the world and ourselves that survival is revolutionary. Now let's talk about identity, because I feel like this part can get messy. And even in my first segment, I was going back and forth between Hispanic Heritage and Latin Heritage Month. So let's break it down. So Hispanic is a U.S. government term that was created in the 70s. And this was just to lump together, everyone who spoke the Spanish language for census purposes. So Spain counts as Hispanic because it's tied to the language. Mexico counts, Puerto Rico counts. But here's the issue. That label it centers like the colonizer's language, and it erases indigenous and Afro-Latinx identities, and it reduces people to whether or not they speak the colonizer language, which is Spanish. And when we hear Latino, Latina, Latin, Latinx, that shifts the focus from language to geography. So if you're from a Latin America, you're Latino. So Brazil counts even though they speak Portuguese because of where Brazil is in Latin America, right? Spain does not count because it is across the waters in Europe. And Latino identity is about the Americas and not Europe. Then we get into like Latinx and Latin, and that is a gender inclusive way or term that breaks away from the masculine and feminine binary standard in Spanish. And some people really want to fight when you say Latinx. And, I feel like it was gaining traction and then it kind of coasted. But it's gaining traction, or it was gaining traction here in the US because it was being used in activist and academic spaces. And Latin is more widely used in Latin America because it actually flows better when someone speaks in that in the Spanish language. People want to fight when you say Latinx. So not all people embrace these terms. Some love them, some reject them, but that is the point. Identity is not a one size fits all. And, from my own personal experience, I think I've shared before too, I'm Black and I am Mexican. And for the longest, I really thought I was, Afro-Latino, but I'm not, because my identity doesn't root from a Latin American country, right? And so whenever I heard Natasha Carrizosa's poem for the first time, Afro-Mexicana, it clicked. So I identify as a Black woman first, but if, I will dabble with a Afro-Mexicana. But there's only one rule that I think should matter here. And it's let people self-identify. So if someone says that they're Hispanic or Chicano or Latin or Afro-Latinx, we're going to respect it. Full stop. And we're not going to argue with people about their own existence. And when we're having these conversations with our homeschoolers, the lesson is simple. We are going to teach kids that identity is fluid, it's political, and it's personal. And if we don't teach them this nuance, the system will teach them about stereotypes. And we don't want to go there. Immigrant history is American history, period. And if we want to be unapologetic about it, immigrant history is not a side chapter. It's not an elective. It is American history. And without it, this country doesn't function, period. So we're going to break it down. So Mexican and Mexican-American labor. So after the U.S. stole half of Mexico's land in the 1800s, Mexican workers built the railroads, the mines, they worked in the mines, harvested crops, and during World War II, there was the Bracero program, which brought Mexican farm workers to the U.S., and they kept American agriculture alive, and even while living in segregated camps, and were denied basic rights. Then we can dabble into Puerto Ricans and the U.S. They've been U.S. citizens since 1917, but have been treated like second-class citizens. And we see that when they are experiencing hurricanes and tsunamis. the US is very slow to support them. Um, and Puerto Ricans had activists like the Young Lords in New York, and they fought for health care and education and housing rights. And they were just as badass as the Black Panthers. So I think a whole unit study on the Young Lords and their social programs and identity would be a dope unit study. Then we have like the Central Americans, we have Guatemalans, Salvadorian, Honduran immigrants who also were part of the backbone of U.S. agriculture and meatpacking till this day because their labor fills our grocery stores. And instead of protections, they've been getting ICE raids and political scapegoating. And it is also important to note we're not celebrating these people based on what labor they can do for this country. It's just the reality that was what was happening. And then when we look at Cubans, we see the post-revolution Cuban immigrants. They transformed Miami's political and cultural identity. And if you've ever been to Miami, that city has a whole vibe, and it is pouring, it just like oozes Latin culture. And you see that presence in the music and in the politics and the businesses that are there. And then we cannot forget the Afro-Latinx voices, right? Because those definitely get erased. I recently got introduced to, and I may be mispronouncing his name, but his name is Arturo Schomburg, and he was a Puerto Rican historian who built one of the most important Black history archives in the world. And then, of course, the queen of salsa, Celia Cruz, she reshaped global music. And, my husband DJ, so even till this day, you put on a Celia Cruz, the house is coming down. And we have to, again, include Afro-Latinx history is also American. But I do want to pause here because I also want you to understand that when we're teaching history, it also means teaching, the complex side of it and not just myths. So, let's look at César Chávez. He is represented as like the Martin Luther King, right? To Mexicans in the labor force, right? He's a civil rights hero, and he co-founded the United Farm Workers Union, and he fought hard and aggressive for labor rights. But the part that rarely gets talked about is that Chávez was very hostile and ugly and just downright disgusting in the way that he treated undocumented immigrants. So in the 70s, Chávez and the UFW actually organized what they called, open parentheses, illegals campaign, close parentheses. And he sent union members, often armed, into fields along the U.S.-Mexico border to intimidate them, to physically intimidate and report undocumented workers. So he was a whole ass snitch. He was not building the underground railroad, by no means. And when I've talked to people about this in person, they're like, no, I'd never heard of it. You're right. So I'm just saying we might need to look at the people, right, that we're celebrating in this regard. And he's one of them. And he, was mad that undocumented immigrants were being used as strike breakers, but instead of building solidarity with them, he was targeting them. And they were like, for him to understand what that work was, he was going after the most exploited people out there, right? Because if they got raises for the people who were documented, the undocumented immigrants were not. And he was still like abusing them. Let's I don't know, Mr. Chávez, we might have to look at it. Then in 1974, Chávez did a whole testimony in front of the Senate and admitted to working with immigration officials to deport undocumented people. Like he was working with the man, y'all. And like he tried to sell it as if he was protecting the union. But in reality, it put the workers against each other and reinforced these anti-immigrant policies. So the messy truth is Chavez wasn't perfect. He fought for some, but not for all. And we have to look at that, especially for today, because who are our people? Who are our skin folk, right? Are they our kinfolk? Because Chavez was tripping. and I know immigrant history is powerful and we should teach it, but it also gets complicated, and it does force us to confront some uncomfortable truths and understand that our heroes have flaws. I know we're celebrating despite the current immigration policies, but I did want to talk about it because I feel like it's an elephant in the room, and we all can acknowledge and agree that immigration policies in this country are violent, right? And we don't want to sugarcoat it. We have families being separated, children sleeping under foil blankets in cages. Deportations are running around the clock, and asylum seekers who were fleeing for their lives are now being criminalized and handcuffed. And we have entire communities living in fear. There are kids being pulled from schools because they're afraid ICE is going to raid them. I have this project idea that I've been thumbing through, but I know there are kids who are no longer in schools because of this immigration policies. And I would like to, my big goal, my big dream would be able to put bilingual homeschooling boxes together to like pass out, maybe work through or work with or partner with immigration attorneys to get the resources to them. So if you have thoughts or ideas, please DM me. I would greatly appreciate having a thought partner on it. But I bring all this up because I want you guys to understand that this isn't new and our ancestors have survived it. We just don't talk about it from the Hispanic Latino communities as much. But in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the U.S. launched Mexican reparation, and it was a campaign that deported up to 1 million people. And many of them were U.S. citizens, and it was just because they looked Mexican. Does that ring a bell? What just happened with our Supreme Court and how and who they've given power to? In the 1950s, I've talked about this before, they had Operation Wetback, and this was a mass deportation program that rounded up thousands of Mexican immigrants and dumped them across the border. Just like that. And if we fast forward to today, immigration detention centers are very much a booming industry. They're very much privatized. Families are still being separated, and politicians from both parties keep recycling this whole "it's a border crisis" rhetoric. And I feel like it scores points with for their political parties while real people are suffering. And we have quite a bit of friends and family, not family, but friends down by the border, and their stories say something completely different than what we're seeing on the news cycle, again, from both political parties. So yeah, immigration policy in America has always been violent. It's not broken. It is working exactly as it was designed to, and it was to criminalize brown bodies while profiting off of their labor. And yet our culture is surviving because you know what? You cannot raid away salsa music. You cannot deport tamales, and you cannot ban bachata. You cannot criminalize storytelling. And our joy, our food, our art, our language, they have survived every policy that has meant to break us. And when we think about it, like every abuela who's making pozole and homemade tortillas in their kitchen, that is a revolutionary act. And when we are teaching our kids cumbia steps, y'all, don't judge me if you ever see my kids do cumbias. But teaching them cumbias in the living room and jamming like Little Joe and La Familia in the mornings for Saturday cleaning, that is resistance. Because every little lullaby that is sung in Spanish to a baby is defiance. And with every poet and every mural and every cookbook and every corrido that passes down, it's proof that our culture isn't going down. It is unkillable. And here's why that matters, especially for homeschooling parents. Because when we teach our kids to celebrate Hispanic and Latin heritage, especially in the face of oppressive policies, we are showing them that joy is power, and we are showing them that celebration is not frivolous, it is resistance. Because the system wants assimilation, it wants silence, it wants kids to forget their roots, so they have to stop fighting for them. But guess what? Every time we dance and we sing and we cook and tell the stories of where we come from, we are spitting in the face of oppression. Y'all, because I have a big pot of beans. I love beans. I don't know about y'all, but I love like when it has like bacon and onions and garlic and jalapenos in it. So anyway, we always eat beans though, but it's a special pot of beans because it's Latin Heritage Month. And we'll probably be making corn tortillas this week. We usually make like from the dried corn. So anyway, that's some of our celebration because we are spitting in the face of oppression. Our joy can't be caged, and we have to remember those things because I don't want you guys to just treat it like a party. I want you to recognize that this is an act of celebrating, the act of remembering, the act of honoring, and all of that in itself is an act of rebellion. So that's what makes this month more than a festival. It makes it a revolution. How allies can celebrate without colonizing the party. If you're not Hispanic or Latinx, and you want to celebrate this month, good, great. But there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. So let's talk about how to get it right. 1, do not throw on a sombrero and fake an accent because that's making a mockery and that is not celebration. 2, do not reduce a whole culture, right? Or different Latin cultures down to just tacos and margaritas. I need you to find some depth. But do your homework, read immigrant stories, learn about colonization, U.S. foreign policy in Latin American countries, and also different Latin-led resistant movements. Also, do local support Latinx authors, Latinx-owned bookstores, artists, oops, and businesses. Spend your money where it matters, where it builds community. And then also, last thing, bring your kids into it because that's the power of homeschooling, right? We get to teach the stories that often get erased or ignored, and we bring them to life here because this isn't about guilt, it's about respect, and you can celebrate without centering yourself. So let's talk resources. I want to offer you guys some books, and I'm going to break them down on from kids to teens to adults. And I just wholeheartedly think these are great books to expose your kid to for the culture aspect. First up is the Ofrenda that we built, and this is by Jolene. My second offering is Squawk of Spanish, and this is about this little boy, Max, and how he's embarrassed about speaking Spanish, and he struggles with like rolling his R's and just pronunciation overall. And you get to really feel the love and the dynamic between him and his abuelita. My third offering is The Interpreter, and it's by Olivia Tahi. And I love this story because it reminds me of so many of my friends that I grew up with who were in this position, but I never thought, I was like, oh, that's just something that they have to do is translate things from English to Spanish for their parents. But I didn't understand the emotional labor behind it until I read this book. And again, this is a middle, like third grade, second, third, fourth grade level book. And she does a really great job of being transparent about being the interpreter for her parents, and she like lets everything out in this book so her parents understand where she's coming from. So anyway, it's called The Interpreter. I think it's worth adding to your library collection because we're all building very, diverse and inclusive book libraries for our kids at home. For middle school, I'm always going to ride for Esperanza Rising by Pam Munoz Ryan. I'm a big fan of Pam Munoz Ryan, but this book right here, this is about Esperanza, who had a different quality of life in Mexico, but her and her family had to flee to the United States where their, overall experience was something they never thought they would go through. And she went from being affluent to a migrant worker. And it's such a beautiful, endearing historical fiction that it's an easy read and it's very relevant to a lot of things that are going on today. So I think it was from like when she was, well, I'm mumbling, but I think it's like early 1900s that it was coming from, or like 1920. But you see a lot of similarities from then to today. So that is always something I'm going to have 10 toes down for. Esperanza Rising. Tumble by Celia C. Perez. It was such a cute read, and it's about this girl who's, she's gonna get adopted by her stepdad, who she loves like no other, like a real dad, because he raised her. But then she finds out about her real dad, who's a real luchador, like a Mexican wrestler. And so you get to learn about the Mexican wrestling connection to the community and just how community shows up, and, even to like extended family and people you make your family. So I don't know. It's such an entertaining and quick and easy read that I laughed a lot. You might not. We are currently reading A Seed in the Sun, so I don't have a full perspective of it yet, but it talks about the power of collective voices and speaking up against injustices. And it's about, Lula and her family. They're migrant farm workers. And, the mom gets sick based on the chemicals or the pesticides that are being used and the type of medical care that she's receiving because of who she is. Then there's a whole migrant worker strike. So we haven't been bored with it, but I think it's worth adding to your collection and checking it out. And it's A Seed in the Sun by Ida Salazar. For adults, I strongly suggest I Am Worthy by Christine Gutierrez. And I feel like this is a book that just makes you pause and take deep breaths, like every other word, because it just hits so close to home. And this is because the world can beat you down whenever you're, I guess, in spaces that have dominant culture, and you might find yourself playing small and you are repressing who you are and like your cultural identity just to, get your head above water in whatever like circle or space that you're in. And there's just like the whole book is just an affirmation and a hug to your identity. And She uses a lot of like indigenous cultural wisdom to just bring you in and to fully understand that you are worthy. And again, the book is I Am Worthy. Check out Hombrecito by Santiago Jose Sanchez. This book is about this young boy who's an immigrant who's trying to figure out how to navigate coming to America and getting lost in assimilation, but also dipping back into the culture that he comes from, and then dealing with, him being queer, but that's not being accepted culturally. So I feel like it's just really intense, and I feel like this is like you feel the journey of him searching for a way to love. And I love when a book just pulls you in and you feel every moment. But it's called Hombrecito by Santiago Jose Chavez. Activities you could weave into your homeschooling is y'all can cook together. You can have the kids, look up food from different Latin American countries and just pick one to cook. So that could be like tamales or pupusas or arroz con leche or even making horchata. Next, you could do an art project. So create some papel picado or look at different weaving styles from different Latin American countries and tie that back to indigenous roots. Or you could just play music and do a music study, play some Celia Cruz or some Selena. Selena is timeless. Or Bad Bunny or Los Lobos or Maná. And talk about how this music carries, culture and resistance. You also could do oral histories, have them interview a family member or a community elder about their migration stories and document them, because that is history. And you also could do some activism lessons. Like you could ask them about, César Chávez immigration policies or an immigration point of view. Or you could look up the 1968 East LA walkouts. And you could have the kids make their own protest posters, or not even, they could make the posters about something they care about now, but learn the activism behind the 1968 East LA walkouts. Because I want you guys to understand that this isn't just cute enrichment.
It's important work that needs to be done. We are doing the work, at least that I didn't have when I was growing up, and we are providing that type of education for our kids.
To close out this episode, I do want to say it again that immigrant history is American history. Hispanic and Latin Heritage Month is not about tokenized gestures. It's about truth and survival and just joy, because joy is revolutionary. And despite every attempt to erase us, we choose to celebrate. And behind every wall, every raid, every policy that's meant to cage us, we're going to celebrate. Because why? Because joy is resistance. So homeschoolers, raise your kids on the truth, teach them honor and not to erase, teach them to celebrate and not stereotype, because that's how you build a revolution inside of your home. And I thank you guys for joining me. This has been Ashley with the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. As always, I encourage you to stay bold, to stay unapologetic, to stay revolutionary, because our joy cannot be taken from us.